Then came a sound, a dry, grating noise, mechanical and organic at the same time, like the sound of something being slowly unscrewed, and the television began to rotate. Joe watched in helpless horror as the heavy-set turned on its base, degrees by slow degrees, the reflection shifting and narrowing as the angle changed, until finally the creature was no longer visible in the screen. He was alone now with only the weight on his back and the darkness and the knowledge that whatever was perched between his shoulder blades was still very much present, even if he could no longer see it. Then the pain came. It was sharp, localized, and intensely specific, a single point of piercing sensation in the middle of his back, lasting perhaps 3 seconds. Then nothing. Then oblivion. When Joe woke the following morning, his first sensation was one of profound wrongness. The grogginess that greeted him was unlike ordinary morning tiredness. It sat behind his eyes like fog, thick and resistant, immune to the usual remedies of stretching and blinking and willing oneself upright. He lay there for several minutes trying to shake it, wondering distantly if he was coming down with something. He eventually rose and made his way to the bathroom, and it was there, as he undressed to shower, that he found a mark. It was on his back, a small, perfectly formed triangle, rendered in vivid red against his pale skin. It was fresh. It was tender. When he pressed it experimentally with one finger, pain radiated outward in sharp, unmistakable waves. It had not been there the night before. He was absolutely certain of this, in the way that one is certain of things one has no reason to doubt until the moment one does. He stood in the bathroom for a long time, staring at the steam beginning to rise from the shower, reconstructing the fragmented images of the previous night. He had assumed, upon waking, that he had experienced a particularly vivid and unpleasant dream. Most of him still wanted to believe this, but the mark on his back made the dream hypothesis significantly harder to maintain. When he returned to his room, wrapped in a towel and still fighting through the mental fog, he stopped dead in the doorway. The television had moved, not dramatically, not across the room onto the floor, but it had rotated on its base, just as he had watched it do in the night, and now sat at a slightly different angle than it had occupied for the entirety of his tenancy. The chest of drawers bore faint scuff marks where the set's base had dragged across the surface. Joe stood in his doorway for a very long time. In the years since, he has never experienced another episode of sleep paralysis. He has never seen anything he could not explain. He went on to complete his degree, build a career, raise a family, and live what he describes as an entirely normal life. But he has never been able to look at a CRT television screen's reflection without feeling the ghost of that pressure between his shoulder blades and the memory of those vast, unblinking eyes looking back at him from across an impossible distance. The experience of Kevin Jones and his then-girlfriend Clara is different from Joe's in one crucial respect. It did not begin suddenly. It built, slowly, methodically, almost patiently, as though something was preparing them, or perhaps preparing itself. Kevin is a native of Wisconsin, a practical and grounded man by his own and others' accounts, not given to flights of fancy or an interest in the paranormal. In the early 2000s, he and Clara were living together in a comfortable house, working ordinary jobs, living what he describes as a deeply normal life. This ordinariness is important to him. He mentions it repeatedly, the way people do when they need you to understand that they had no framework for what was coming. It started, unremarkably, with a shadow. Kevin was at his computer one afternoon, working, focused, not thinking about anything unusual, when he caught a glimpse of something in his peripheral vision. To the left, just at the edge of his sight, a small, dark figure, standing still. He turned his head. Nothing was there. The room was exactly as it always was, empty and familiar and entirely explicable. He dismissed it immediately. Peripheral visual anomalies are common. The eye plays tricks, especially when one is tired or staring at a screen for extended periods. He made a mental note to get more sleep, and returned to his work. But it happened again, and again, and again. Over the following days, the figure appeared at all hours in all locations, in the hallway, in the kitchen, in the garden glimpsed through a window, always at the periphery, always vanishing the instant he tried to focus on it directly. Each individual sighting was easy enough to dismiss. The accumulation of them was considerably harder. What shattered his ability to rationalize entirely was a conversation he had with Clara one evening, almost a week after his first sighting. He had decided to mention it to her, more as an offhand observation than a serious disclosure, half expecting her to laugh and tell him to get more sleep. Instead, her face went very still. She had been seeing it too. They compared their experiences with a careful, tentative manner of two people who are not yet ready to name what they are describing. The figures were the same: small, dark, peripheral, gone the moment attention was directed at them. Neither of them had said anything because neither of them had wanted to be the first one to suggest that something impossible might be happening in their home. From that conversation onward, the house felt different to both of them. The comfortable familiarity of their shared space developed an unpleasant undertone, a background frequency of unease that neither could fully articulate but both could feel. The sensation of being watched, not metaphorically, not anxiously, but literally and specifically watched, became a constant companion. Then the object began to move. Framed photograph fell from walls where they had hung, undisturbed, for years. Items on shelves toppled for no discernible reason. In each case, Kevin and Clara were in different rooms, nowhere near the objects in question, and no vibration or structural cause could be identified. Twice they returned home from errands to find the cushions from their sofa arranged on the living room floor in precise pentagonal formations, each time identical, each time unmistakably deliberate in its geometry, each time utterly impossible to explain. The jokes about haunted houses, which had initially served as a kind of pressure valve, gradually stopped being funny. Then came the night of the sound. They were in the living room together, Clara watching television, Kevin reading, when Kevin heard it, a metallic, rhythmic beeping, like Morse-code tapped out on a small, precise instrument. But the sound had no external source. It did not come from the television, or from outside, or from any identifiable point in the room. It came from inside his head, from the center of his skull, he would later say, as though something had installed a small transmitter in the architecture of his mind and was now making its first broadcast. The sound lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then faded. Kevin lowered his book. Clara had turned from the television and was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, a mixture of confusion, recognition, and a particular kind of fear that comes not from encountering something terrifying but from having one's entire model of reality quietly undermined. "Did you just hear that?" she asked. Neither of them could locate the direction from which the sound had come. Neither could quite describe it adequately. Strangest of all, their two dogs, animals who had previously demonstrated an enthusiastic willingness to bark at passing bicycles, rustling leaves, and the neighbor's entirely inoffensive cat, had not reacted at all. They lay in their habitual positions, breathing slowly, utterly unperturbed. Kevin and Clara went to bed. What else was there to do? They woke the following morning to a shared and sourceless feeling that something was wrong. Clara discovered a tender, inflamed patch of skin on her abdomen, just below her navel, a small, so area that she could not account for and that had not been there the night before. Kevin felt a disconnection from reality that he struggled to describe but compared, in his account to us, to the feeling of watching one's own life through a pane of glass, present in body but somehow removed, as though the normal sense of immediate, unmediated existence had been replaced by something with a slight but persistent delay. In the weeks that followed, both of them were visited by dreams. The figures in these dreams were consistent, the same small, pale, wrong-proportioned beings, observed always from a slight distance, always in a context of clinical examination or dispassionate observation. For Clara, the dreams were unpleasant but manageable. For Kevin, they became something worse. The images grew more vivid, more insistent, more difficult to separate from waking life. He developed a severe insomnia, afraid to sleep, dreading the moment each night when his defenses would lower and the figures would return to stand over him in the peculiar, intimate darkness of unconscious experience. Eventually, on the advice of a friend, he sought out a hypnotherapist. He told the therapist about his sleep problems, and then, reluctantly, watching the therapist's face carefully for signs of skepticism or amusement, he described the dreams. The therapist did not laugh. Instead, he listened with increasing attention, and when Kevin finished, he sat quietly for a moment before suggesting, carefully, that Kevin might benefit from hypnotic regression. Kevin agreed, with the trepidation of a man who has run out of other options. What the regression uncovered changed everything he thought he knew about that night. Under hypnosis, Kevin remembered waking. He had been lying on his back, and the room was dark, and he had known immediately, with a wordless certainty of dreams or extreme shock, that something was happening. He could not move. The paralysis was total, extending to his neck, his hands, his feet, everything except his eyes, which moved frantically in their sockets, sweeping the room for information. At the foot of the bed, a black silhouette stood motionless. It had no features that he could identify, no face, no hands, no discernible texture. It was simply an absence of light in the shape of something that should not have been there. Clara's side of the bed was empty. The covers had been swept back from her side, neatly, as though she had simply gotten up for a glass of water. But something about the neatness of it was wrong, too precise, too deliberate, like a stage set arranged to suggest normalcy while communicating anything but. Movement at the edge of his vision. Another silhouette, smaller than the first, passing along the wall toward the doorway. Kevin fought to turn his head and failed utterly. His body was not his own. Then he felt himself rising. Not falling, not dreaming, not the narrative metaphor of floating that appears in certain sleep experiences, actually rising, his body lifting from the mattress with a smooth and purposeful momentum, rotating slowly until he was on his side, facing the doorway. And in the doorway, moving away from him into the hole, was the second silhouette, and beside it, hovering perhaps 6 inches above the floor, was Clara. She was moving as though being pulled by a wire attached to her sternum, a smooth and continuous motion that her own body was not producing. Her eyes were open. Her expression was the most frightening thing Kevin had ever seen, not screaming, not contorted, but wide and still and absolutely terrified, the face of someone who has passed through shock into a kind of enforced, terrible calm. She was looking at the ceiling. She could no more choose what to look at than Kevin could. He was moved through the doorway. In the hallway, a third figure waited. Unlike the first two, featureless black shapes, this one had something approaching visible form. Kevin's eyes, the only part of him still operating under his own control, strained for details. A short frame, a head too large for the body beneath it, rounded and hairless, the color of old concrete, the suggestion, barely resolved, of a face. The figure turned toward him. The last thing Kevin Jones remembered, before the memory dissolved into blankness, was a face filling his entire field of vision, pale and enormous-eyed and expressionless, positioned perhaps 6 inches from his own, regarding him with an attention that felt neither cruel nor kind but simply absolute. Then nothing. Kevin emerged from hypnosis shaking. The therapist sat with him for a long time afterward, neither of them speaking. There are no established protocols for what to do when a patient remembers something like this. The therapist was honest about the limitations of hypnotic regression, honest about the ways in which the mind can construct narratives under suggestion, honest about the impossibility of distinguishing recovered memory from elaborated fantasy. Kevin listened to all of this carefully and acknowledged every caveat. He remains, to this day, absolutely and quietly certain that it was not a dream. Clara and Kevin eventually parted ways, as couples sometimes do, especially couples who have shared experiences that can never be adequately spoken about to anyone else. Clara did not pursue hypnotic regression herself. She simply decided, at some point, that there were doors she preferred not to open. Kevin understands this. He says he respects it. But sometimes, late at night, he wonders what she remembers. Manny was born in Germany in 1988, which made him 17 years old in the summer of 2005 when his skepticism encountered something it was not equipped to handle. He had a friend, a girl named Amal, who was, in his tolerant and affectionate view, a fantasist. She had believed in aliens for as long as he had known her, with a particular and unself-conscious conviction that he found both amusing and faintly endearing. She didn't push her beliefs on anyone, didn't demand validation, didn't surround herself with the usual paraphernalia of committed UFO enthusiasts. She simply believed, quietly and matter-of-factly, the way other people believe in God or in the essential goodness of humanity. One day, Manny asked her to describe what they looked like. Her answer surprised him with its specificity. She wasn't describing the gray, large-headed figures of popular culture. Her visitors were tall, she said, slim, white-skinned, in many cases nearly indistinguishable from humans, particularly the females. They had been visiting her, she said, since she was a small child. She spoke about this with the same calm tone one might use to describe an unusual but not unwelcome house guest. Manny listened, smiled, and In the spirit of good-natured humor, the kind of joke that relies on the absolute impossibility of its premise, told her to pass along a message. Tell them, he said, that he'd like to meet them. Tell them they should come and visit. Amal looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she nodded once and changed the subject. Manny forgot about it entirely within a few days. It was the kind of throwaway remark that dissolves immediately upon being made. Until the hot night in July 2005 when he was pulled from a deep sleep by a sound he had never heard before. It was a buzzing, not the mechanical buzz of an electrical appliance or the organic buzz of an insect, but something in between, resonant and directional, seeming to come from everywhere in the room simultaneously. He lay in the darkness with his eyes open, listening, and knew with an immediacy that bypassed all rational consideration that he was not alone in the room. He lifted his hand to rub his eyes. Something held it down, not violently, not with a crushing grip of a restraint, but with a firm, deliberate pressure, the unmistakable physical communication of not yet. He lay motionless, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure it must be audible, and then the pressure released. He looked down at his hand in time to see it, long, pale fingers, white, almost luminous in the ambient darkness, unnervingly slender, withdrawing from his wrist and receding into the shadows at the edge of his room. He spun and turned on his lamp. The room was empty. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was misplaced. The window was closed and locked. The door was closed and locked. There was no physical evidence that anything unusual had occurred, except that he was wide awake and shaking at 3 in the morning with the absolutely unambiguous physical memory of a hand that was not human holding his. It happened twice more over the following weeks. Each time, the same buzzing. Each time, the same certainty of company in the darkness. He never saw anything else clearly, only that hand, once, withdrawing. Finally, with the pragmatic directness of someone who has decided that dignity is less important than sleep, he told Amal what had been happening. He was not joking this time. She listened to him without surprise. When he finished, she asked if he wanted her to pass along another message. He said yes. He said, "Thank you for visiting, but please stop." He was very clear about this. The experiences cease entirely. They have never returned. Manny has spent the years since turning the episode over in his mind without ever arriving at a satisfactory explanation. He is still not sure he believes in aliens, precisely, but he is very careful now about what he jokes about, and very careful about requests he makes lightly, and very careful about assuming that the universe's response to a throwaway remark will necessarily be nothing. 3 stories. 3 individuals with no connection to one another, from different countries, different decades, different circumstances. Their accounts share certain details, paralysis, peripheral figures, sounds with no external source, physical evidence that shouldn't exist, and diverge in others, in ways that suggest lived experience rather than borrowed narrative. The skeptical interpretation is available, and it has merit. Sleep paralysis is a genuine and well-documented phenomenon in which the brain, caught between sleep and wakefulness, generates hallucinations of remarkable vividness while the body remains motionless. It produces exactly the experiences described: the inability to move, the sensation of weight or pressure, the overwhelming feeling of presence. For Joe and Kevin, who were both asleep when their experiences began, this framework offers a partial explanation, but only partial. Sleep paralysis does not move televisions. It does not leave triangular marks on backs or inflamed patches on stomachs. It does not produce sounds heard simultaneously by 2 people. It does not affect partners differently, or leave dogs unmoved, or end permanently and precisely when a specific, personal request is made. And then there are the cases that occur not in bedrooms but on empty roads at midnight, in fields, in the bright and unambiguous clarity of waking daylight. Sleep paralysis accounts for none of these. There is another framework, more uncomfortable for both believer and skeptic alike. What if these experiences are real, but not physical? What if the beings described, whoever or whatever they are, interact not with bodies but with consciousness itself? This would explain the elusiveness of evidence. It would explain the internal sounds that dogs cannot hear. It would explain the impossible intimacy of the encounters, the sense that whatever is happening specifically and personally, tailored to the individual mind it has chosen to enter. It might also explain an unsettling experiment conducted by a team at Planet Weird, in which a hypnotist planted a single, minimal suggestion in the mind of a self-described skeptic, a light at a window, a figure in the room, nothing more, and the subject emerged from the trance with complete, detailed, emotionally overwhelming memory of being taken aboard a craft and examined. The suggestion had been a seed. The mind had grown a forest. What does this mean? That abduction memories are fabricated? Or that the hypnotist had accidentally provided the precise psychological key required to unlock a doorway that was already there? Some researchers have gone further still. They point to the sulfur reported by abductees, a smell with ancient and specific cultural associations. They point to the way certain encounters reportedly end the instant the name of Christ is invoked. They point to medieval illustrations of demonic imps, rendered in painstaking detail by artists who had never seen a science fiction film, and note with discomfort how closely these ancient figures resemble the being described in modern accounts. Perhaps, they suggest, our ancestors understood something about these entities that we, in our eagerness to look outward into space, have forgotten how to see. Perhaps the barrier between what we consider consensus reality and whatever lies beyond it is thinner than we prefer to believe. Perhaps what abductees experience is a thinning. The sounds, the smells, the peripheral figures in the days before an encounter is exactly that, a literal weakening of whatever membrane separates us from something else. And perhaps, when that membrane becomes thin enough, something passes through. 3 ordinary people went to sleep in ordinary rooms. They woke to find that ordinary had been quietly, permanently revised. They cannot prove what happened to them. They have stopped trying, for the most part. Instead, they have simply learned to live inside the question, carrying it the way you carry any wound that never quite heals, that aches sometimes in certain kinds of weather, that reminds you, on quiet nights, that the world extends considerably further than the edges of what you can see. The lights outside are on. The windows are locked. The room is ordinary in every detail. Sleep, if you can. For decades, stories of mysterious abductions have woven themselves into the fabric of Western culture so completely that they become almost mundane, punchlines in late-night comedy sketches, fodder for low-budget science fiction films, and shorthand for a certain kind of unhinged belief. But in becoming so familiar, something vital has been lost. The nuance, the texture, the deeply human terror that lives at the heart of each individual account. What most people picture when they hear the phrase alien abduction is a stock image, blinding light over a darkened field, a helpless figure rising toward a hovering craft, cold examination tables, and enormous black eyes staring without mercy. These images, repeated endlessly across television and cinema, have effectively replaced the real stories. Stories far stranger, far more personal, and in many ways far more disturbing than any Hollywood dramatization could capture. What gets edited out, almost universally, are the days and hour before the encounter itself, the creeping dread, the inexplicable sounds, the sense of being watched by something that is always just outside the edge of vision. And what gets dismissed even more readily are the weeks and months after, the lasting psychological wounds, the changed relationships, the inability to ever again feel entirely safe within one's own bedroom. It is perhaps finally time to listen more carefully, to slow down, to sit with the details that don't fit neatly into either the believer's narrative or the skeptic's dismissal. The accounts that follow were submitted directly to Bedtime Stories by the individuals themselves, men and women who insist, with quiet and unshakable conviction, that what happened to them was real. Joe Keel is not his real name. He requested a pseudonym, as he has never spoken publicly about what happened to him in the autumn of 1989, and he has no intention of starting now. He is, by his own description, a quiet and private man who spent decades trying to rationalize an experience that refuses to be rationalized. In 1989, Joe was a first-year student at Bristol University in England. He was 20 years old, enthusiastic about his studies, mildly homesick, and entirely unremarkable in every way that he could identify. He lived in a modest student room, small, cluttered with textbooks, smelling faintly of instant noodles and damp carpet. It was the kind of room that thousands of students have inhabited before and since, utterly ordinary in every detail except one. Across from his bed, sitting atop a heavy chest of drawers, was an old CRT television set, a massive, hulking thing his parents had pressed upon him when he left for university, the kind of set that weighed as much as a small child, whose curved screen cord and held ambient light in a particular way. On nights when the street lamps outside threw their amber glow through his thin curtains, that screen functioned almost like a mirror, reflecting a softened, slightly distorted version of the room back at him. Joe had never thought much about this. It was simply a feature of his room, like the dripping tap in the bathroom down the hall or the irregular clanking of the radiator in winter. Until the night everything changed. He woke suddenly at approximately 2 a.m. There was no gradual surfacing from sleep, no slow blinking ascent into wakefulness. One moment he was deeply unconscious, the next he was sharply, almost painfully awake. He was lying on his stomach, his face turned to one side, and the first thing he noticed was that the room felt different. Not in any way he could immediately articulate. The temperature was normal. The sounds of the street outside were normal, but something in the atmosphere of the room had changed, like a subtle shift in air pressure before a storm. Then he tried to move, and discovered that he could not. It wasn't the vague, struggling heaviness of a deep sleep from which one hasn't quite emerged. This was something else entirely, a complete and absolute inability to move any part of his body. His arms, his legs, his neck, his fingers, all of them were perfectly unresponsive, as if the connection between his brain and his muscles had been severed cleanly at the source. Only his eyes could move, rolling in their sockets with a desperate, animal urgency. He became aware, a moment later, of the pressure. Something was sitting on his back. It was not the vague, diffuse weight of a blanket or the imagined heaviness of sleep. This was specific and physical, a concentrated point of downward force position between his shoulder blades, as though something had settled there deliberately and was now making itself comfortable. The weight was not crushing, but it was undeniable. It was there. Joe's eyes found a television screen. In the soft amber reflection, he could see his own bed, his own still form, the familiar contours of his room rendered in that slightly warped, slightly dreamlike way that CRT screens produced. And there, crouching on his back, was a shape he had no framework to understand. It was roughly the size of a child, perhaps 3 feet tall, but the proportions were entirely wrong. The head was grotesquely oversized, far too large for the slender, almost skeletal body beneath it. The limbs were thin in a way that suggested not malnourishment, but a fundamentally different architecture, as though the underlying structure of bones and joints operated according to different principles than the human skeleton. The thing was utterly still, and in its stillness, it projected an unsettling quality of attention, as though it was engaged in some form of focused, deliberate activity. Joe stared at it. He could not scream. He could not flinch. All he could do was watch its reflection in the dead television's glass. Then the creature's head moved. It turned, with a smooth and liquid motion that seemed somehow too fluid for any neck to produce, until those eyes, enormous, almond-shaped, catching the ambient light like black mirrors within mirrors, were looking directly back at him through the reflection. For one long, terrible moment, the creature and the paralyzed young man regarded each other across the strange doubled space of the television screen, predator and prey separated by nothing but a layer of glass and a thin fiction of ordinary reality.